in radio. To the extent that you have been following this, and I know that you're steeped in this, have you seen any consistent proof that actual negotiations are underway?
Well, Joe, first, thank you for having me on the program. I think there were initial reports that suggested that U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, were in Pakistan, but it turns out that Witkoff was at a conference in Florida. And so we know that there's a trifecta of countries in the region, Egypt, Pakistan, and Turkey, that have been pushing for a diplomatic solution. But the 15-point plan that reportedly the United States had put out had initially been rejected by the Iranians, at least per state media. And now we're hearing that Iranian officials are actually looking into it and trying to see what maybe there would be a middle ground. But at this moment, there's not any face-to-face or indirect talks happening just yet.
Well, interesting. The president says J.D. Vance, vice president, will help to lead these negotiations once they reach a formal and direct point. I just wonder, broadly speaking here, you've obviously had several weeks to think about this. Is there a path out of this war, diplomatically speaking, in which the IRGC remains in power and the people of Iran gain more rights and a better life?
It's hard to imagine that, because I think we've seen 47 years of what they're capable of. And we had this unprecedented massacre in January in response to yet another cyclical anti-regime protest of thousands, if not tens of thousands of Iranians that were killed. And that was why military assets were moved to the region to begin with. And so I think if the Islamic Republic wanted to course correct, they would have, in having heard so much anger from their people for years. And so I just can't imagine they would do a complete 180, because it wouldn't be the Islamic Republic then.
President Trump speaking in Miami, Holly, and I haven't heard this exact line yet, that Iran conducted nuclear blackmail for years and years, as we constantly hear, 47 years. Of course, it wasn't quite that long with nuclear technology. But what do you make of that framing of the Iranian regime?
I'm not entirely sure what he's in reference to, because we had a multilateral deal known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or JCPOA, or popularly known as the Iran nuclear deal. And so the president withdrew from that deal in 2018 without really having something to replace it. And arguably, we're in this moment, in this war, because we've never actually gone back to a deal and had a diplomatic solution that would curb Iran's enrichment in exchange for sanctions relief. And so I'm not entirely sure what he's in reference to. Perhaps this notion that they might have been hiding the 400 kilograms of enriched uranium that we don't know where it's at, or the fact that there were some particles found at undeclared sites years ago.
How varied, to the extent that you can speak to this, how varied are the opinions of Iranians when it comes to this war?
Well, I think it's important to emphasize we're in an internet shutdown that started tomorrow will be 1 month. And it's really hard to get information out of the country. What we're getting is from landlines and from Starlink terminals. There's about 50 to 60,000 users. And I think there's really, it's harder to obviously measure these things harder than before. But I think there's a couple of trends that are really standing out. There's a mix of hope and fear. Hope that this will lead to a positive outcome where the regime is no longer in power and a democratic transition happens. Fear because this is a war and there are civilian casualties. There's about 1,500 civilian casualties since the war began, according to the group Human Rights Activists in Iran. But also fear that what happens if this regime survives. And I think there's a real worry about what the Islamic Republic will do to its people. And we saw that happen with the unprecedented massacre in January. So I think those are really the two trend lines you're seeing at this juncture.
Why would the Ayatollah cut a deal? And what would compel him to cut a deal after losing his family and being badly wounded in the initial strikes? Or is that not who the deal would be with? Would it be with secular leadership, Holly?
I think that's a question people are scratching their head and asking themselves. I know the president has hoped to get a Venezuela-like deal or scenario out of this. Yeah. He's been looking for a Delcy Rodriguez figure. But the truth is the Islamic Republic won't back down. It won't give up its ballistic missiles program. It won't give up its nuclear program. So it's hard for me to imagine, especially as you noted, that the current supreme leader, Mojtaba Khamenei, would give in to those demands, because that would be seen as giving into the quote unquote great Satan, or the United States and Israel. And so I just can't see this regime making a deal like that, because then it would go against everything the Islamic Republic stands for. And the war has, in essence, created a scenario where there's more hardline figures taking the place of former officials that were killed. So I just can't imagine. I'd say that they would rather the Islamic Republic, or the country as a whole, burn than give in to those sort of demands, at least at this juncture.
Wow. We haven't mentioned Israel yet. Is it possible to actually have a deal between the U.S. and Iran without Israel signing on?
I don't think so. And I think that this is where the conversations between the United States and Israel arguably diverge. I think that President Trump was okay with regime change, and that is a change of leadership at the top. But I think that the Israelis would like to see regime collapse. They don't want to deal with this regime anymore. I think there's a recognition that that they will continue to rebuild ballistic missiles, to enrich uranium. And I'd argue that the president has been pushing for a Venezuela scenario, but I think in this moment he's created a North Korea, a regime that's more hardline, repressive. Wow. And if it had its druthers and was able to, it would develop a nuclear weapon just so it could prevent another conflict in the near future.
Well, that's an important view, Holly. With that said, what about the rest of the neighborhood? Iran got a missile through, at least one, to a Saudi airbase today, hit a couple of tankers on the ground, and some U.S. service members were injured. How likely is it that Saudi Arabia or others enter this conflict?
I don't think that they would enter it directly. I think there's a recognition that this is something the United States and Israel would lead, but I imagine they're scratching their head and thinking twice about where this war goes, because if this regime does survive, this is a neighbor that's going to be a lot more aggressive, a neighbor that is able to close the Strait of Hormuz. And I think that they're trying to understand that this is a regime that may not be worth talking to in the way they have in the past, especially for Saudi Arabia. I imagine they feel slighted after the Oman/China brokered deal in 2023 that helped Iran and Saudi Arabia recommence ties. And so I imagine that they're thinking twice about that. I know that they haven't called on the Iranian ambassador to be persona non grata, but I imagine that they're going to start thinking twice, as we've seen in the case of Lebanon and Qatar.